It was on December 19th, several years ago, that our son David was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is a bone cancer that would take his life in 11 and a half months. And during this time, during his diagnosis, the agenda that we made for our lives changed instantaneously. And we went on a journey that was difficult, but then the one that we watched David go through, as he found the victory in each day, not in the answer to a prayer that we had expected. And it was an adventure that was full of hardships and pain and difficulty, but our God was so faithful. And we learned much during that time, but probably what we learned the very most was that we had a connection with heaven, that a God that loved David so much more than we did gave us a connection and had a provision for a heaven. And I'm going to share just a couple of those things with you today. But one of them was towards the end of David's illness. I believe it was in September or October that our family took a trip to Yosemite Park, because that was a place Dave had always wanted to go. He loved the outdoors and he loved to see it. And as we went up to Yosemite and we went to one of those beautiful areas that you go and look out over Half Dome, perhaps some of you have been there, and it was just majestic. And we went there as a family and we oohed and ahed, and after a short time I watched my Donnie, and he was dropping little stones down into the valleys to see how far they could go and where they would bounce off. And Kathy was trying to climb a huge rock that was there. But David sat there in his wheelchair and continued to gaze out over the same picture, looking at Half Dome and all the beauty that was there. And I went over to him and I said, "Dave, isn't it pretty?" And he said, "No, Mom, look at it. Look at it again." He said, "It's beautiful." He said, "Just look. Mom, think, if God has created this beauty for us here, what must heaven be like, Mom? What must it be like? How much more beautiful can this be?" David was 15, and he was beginning to look at the beauty around him as we should all be looking. I have never once again looked at a fall tree or a flower or a sunset or a sunrise. I have never once again looked at it without thinking, how much more beautiful could heaven be than this? It was shortly after that time that we came home, and David was asked by Christian Heritage School to write a paper on the last 8.5 months of his life. It was his journey. He couldn't see very well at that time because of the medication he was taking, and they thought it wasn't necessary for him to read the book, The Pilgrim's Progress, because he'd been on it. And he wrote a wonderful paper on how God had met his needs during this last 8.5 months. A paper that was published several times as a source of encouragement at Sloan Kettering Hospital. But this paper was also gotten into the hands of Tony Dolan, who at that time was the speechwriter for President Ronald Reagan. And Tony Dolan gave it to Ronald Reagan. And he asked to see David in Washington. And they flew us as a family to Washington to have a special luncheon in David's honor. Now, when we got there, it was as though Washington had closed down, and all the people there had gotten together to make a special day for our son. And in my mother's heart, I was so grateful. And it was a beautiful day, and he got to share his testimony with Ronald Reagan, and we had a lovely lunch. But as we were coming home, and we were being flown into Sikorsky Airport, we had a small plane, and it was beginning to be dusk. And as we came over the field, we could see a tremendous amount of people down at Sikorsky Airport. So many. And David said to me, "Mom, what on earth is going on down there?" And I said, "Dave, I have no idea. Maybe someone important is coming." And Donnie teasingly said, "Maybe it's you, Dave." And we all chuckled. But as we got down closer and we looked across the airport, there were hundreds of people, and we could begin to see the banners that had been draped over the fencing. Well done, Dave. Welcome home. We had been with the most powerful leader in the world, and it didn't hold a candle to that homecoming. Not a candle. And as we came off of the plane, and we saw so many people, some were his classmates, but many I had never seen before, many David had never met. They had come to welcome him. And there was such a feeling of love. And it was my job at that particular time to push his wheelchair. And I couldn't go. I was going so slowly, and he was becoming impatient with me. He wanted to get to them. And finally, he took the wheels by his hands and propelled himself quickly until he was enveloped into the group of people, and I couldn't see him any longer. And I stood back, and I watched. And the words came to me. How much more beautiful if this is the welcome we could receive on earth. How much more beautiful will our welcome be in heaven by those who create us, by those who love us. It was a short time afterwards that David was received home into his heavenly home. And his last words to me were, "Mom, who's in the room with us?" And I said, "No one's in the room, Dave. Go back to sleep." And he was dozing in and out, and he woke up again, and he said, "Mom, who's in the room with us?" And I said, "There's no one here, David. Marianne's gone off duty. Just go back to sleep, you're tired." And he pointed to the corner of the room with no fear and said, "Yes, Mom, someone's over there." And I said, "No, honey." And he closed his eyes. I believe God sent his angels. It wasn't for me to know, but it was his homecoming. He was welcomed home. He was welcomed home by a God who loved him so. And I just want to end with just telling a story, a Christmas story of one of our Christmases at our home. Our children have always enjoyed Christmas at our home. It's very fun. It's always very fun. And we would wrap the little presents and get those things that we would need to get together. But the most important thing that happened was that we had a daddy gift. I could go out and buy lots of little things and wrap them and put them under the tree. But Bruce would buy one gift a year, and it would be his daddy gift. It would always be the perfect gift. It would be so special. And no matter what we had in under the Christmas tree, days before Christmas, you could hear the children saying, "I wonder what Daddy got. I wonder what the daddy gift will be." And they always waited to open that last. Well, on this particular Christmas day, Bruce was having a lot of problem with David's gift. He didn't know what to get him. He didn't know what would be appropriate. He just couldn't find what felt good to him. And on Christmas Eve, Bruce came home. And he said to me, "I found it. I found the perfect gift for David." And he took me into the living room to show it to me. And out of this big bag, he lifted a toolbox. And with the toolbox, he took out a pliers and a hammer and a screwdriver and a Phillips head and all those little things that go into a toolbox. Well, I need to tell you, David never asked for a toolbox. David had a long list of things he wanted, but a toolbox wasn't on them. David showed absolutely no interest in building. And Bruce was so excited about this gift. And in my heart, I thought, oh, he's going to be disappointed. David's going to be disappointed. But I couldn't say anything to Bruce. It was Christmas Eve. I didn't want him to think he had bought the wrong thing. So being the dutiful wife, I kept it to myself and worried. And on Christmas morning, when the kids got up They opened their presents, and it was a lovely Christmas, and Donnie opened his daddy gift first, and then Kathy hers. And then David and I watched intently as he opened it to see what his expression would be on his face. And he took the toolbox out, and he looked at it. And very carefully he took each one of the tools that he unwrapped and placed them into the box. And he was so happy. He treated it with such joy. And as a mom, I was just happy that he liked it. Well, that night when it came time to tuck him into bed, I went up into his room and he said, "Mom, I will never ask Daddy for a gift for Christmas again. I will never tell him what I want. I will never make him a list because Daddy always knows what to get me. Daddy's gift is always perfect. No matter whether I ask for it or not, it's always right." 2 days before he died, David wanted to leave something to his brother and sister. And what he chose to leave to Donnie was his toolbox, one of his most cherished possessions. It would not have been my choice for David to be taken to heaven at what seemed to be an early age. It's not what I would have chosen. But I tell you that I would never question my Heavenly Father because He always knows what's right. And even though it may not be what we expect, He is a God who loves us tremendously. And as a mom, how I appreciate the depth of His love for my son. It was so much deeper than mine. And I am so grateful for the provision of heaven that He's made for all of us and for those that we love. I thank you.